So I've made some progress offline. I'll just give this a quick render. I have a couple of different assets here, and I spent some time organizing these things. I have a three-way stop, I have a four-way stop, I have a straight, and a curve. And with those different combinations of streets, I feel like I could build an entire city. Now, I may want to create a little more variation on the street, but right now I have just about everything that I need. So, for example, if I were to take a copy of the straight, and I'll just move this over. Now remember, this whole thing is on a 2,000 centimeter grid, and so if I rough this into place or if I move it more precisely, if I start to round these values, these position values out to 2,000, and just to their closest, 0, 2,000, negative 2,000, negative 4,000, they should snap perfectly in place. And if I just take this straight street and I rotate it, I'm holding down the shift key and I rotate it 90 degrees, they'll all snap together. So I have this system in place where I could very quickly, rapidly prototype a city. So again, I'll just move this to 2000. This is clearly not the position that I want it to be in, but if I just give this a quick rotate, and I'll make sure that I'm holding down the shift key once I start to rotate this, and I can position these elements, and I think you'll find it's probably pretty quick just to start keying in some of the values here. And you can really quickly kind of snap together this system. Now, I've made this file available to you inside the project folder, so you can download it and take a look at some of the decisions that I made in terms of size and scale. And you can reverse engineer these assets. I want to focus a little bit on the rest of my environment, and so when it comes to building these buildings, I want to make sure that I'm building the buildings with enough information so that they feel like they're fully realized. They can still be shorthanded, still be very efficient and very stylized, and yet I think what I want to do is start to build some simple variation on these basic buildings. And so if I focus on the buildings just for a moment, I'll take this this first building that I created and I'll copy and paste it so I have a duplicate of it. Now I have the exact same building over here. Now I don't want to scale this, and I do want to continue to model additional buildings, but I can also do things like just create variation on the same building that I have. Now, when I created this cube, I actually want to create the cube so that it's in the same position as the building, and I find the easiest thing to do is just take that original building and temporarily zero out its coordinates. Now I'm going to leave the y coordinates the same because I was satisfied with the position, its vertical position. It was just the x and the z that needed to be modified. Now I'll take the original cube, the new cube that I just created, and I'll key in just a couple of different values. I'm going to set the base size here to like 500 centimeters in all directions. So now I have this additional detail down here at the bottom, and I'll make it much taller. Maybe I'll set this to 500 as well, and I'll make sure that's just starting to intersect with the ground. I'll take the new building and I'll reposition that vertically. Okay, and very quickly I'm going to have an additional building here just by creating a little variation. Maybe I'll throw some doors down here and some windows. Maybe I'll add some details around the sides here. But you can see very quickly that if I just group these two together, now I have a second building. It's much taller than the first, and maybe I don't want the building that tall. Okay, and maybe I'll take this little cube that I created and paste a duplicate and move it way up here, and I'll make some kind of element on the roof, kind of a platform just to create a little more variation. Okay, maybe I'll add some, little vents and smokestacks and some other things just to create some real simple variation on the same building. Now I can continue to play with a lot of these values and do the same technique that I did with the windows and just rough out some different style buildings here. And I'll do some of that experimentation offline. So I really want you to, when it comes to the buildings, look at existing reference of buildings, look at all the examples that I posted in the lesson folder and see how you can create some different variation using the modeling techniques that we covered in the desk scene project. Now, when it comes to some of the materials, we can always go into our content browser and I just want to remind you that there's a, if we go into our content browser and we go into the Prime folder and we go into materials and we go into basic, there are some great materials in here. And right off the bat, I think this brick 2 material might be something that comes in handy. Of course, the sky as well, and all these other concrete and other basic materials. You know, I could throw some concrete on these, some bricks on these existing buildings, and I'll just take these values and I'll take them way down to scale them to make them make a little bit more sense relative to the size of the building. So maybe if I scale this down to 10% and the vertical down to 10%, now we're starting to get this kind of brick material applied to this building. I'll do the same thing. I'll replace the concrete material, the temporary placeholder, onto this other building, and so we'll create additional variation. I'll just select that material tag, and just very quickly I can get at I can get at a very different looking building. So obviously, you know, I want to continue to experiment with this, but those are just some basic techniques. In addition to that, I can actually start to build my own materials inside Photoshop, and so there's a number of different ways that we can go about this. I don't want to take a deep dive into building seamless textures. There's a lot of tutorials out there on the web, but you can build your own seamless textures. We'll take a look at body paint, which is another module inside Cinema 4D as an option that you can use to start creating more custom materials. But start to play around with some of the material settings and create simple variation on buildings. Now, once I start to rough out the basic city, again, I'm going to need to spend a lot of time working on the buildings, and I'm going to do that offline. I want to keep them very simple, but then I want to start to rough out the composition of my entire city. But before I do this, I want to start thinking about the lighting inside the environment. So when I render this, I'm still in the default lighting setup, and I'm underwhelmed with the visual quality of my scene so far. And so what I'm going to do is I'll start to think about lighting. And I'll get started this time around, instead of creating a point light or a spotlight, and I'll continue to use some of those lights inside my scene, I want to experiment with an infinite light. And an infinite light is a light that's infinitely far away. And so its position in the scene doesn't matter. So as I move the infinite light around, it doesn't change the overall look of this. You can think of an infinite light as maybe the sunshine or a moon that's casting light. The important quality of an infinite light is its rotation. So if I go to the rotate tool and I rotate this and I change the angle, the infinite light points down the z-axis or the blue axis, and so I can just kind of rotate this around, and I'm thinking about that blue axis as the axis the direction the light is coming from. So I can rotate this around, and what I'll do is I'll select back on the light, and I'll just set this to maybe kind of a nice orange or yellow, just a real warm light that the sun might cast. So I'm casting some yellow light. I'm going to go to shadows, and if I turn on shadow map soft, you're probably not going to get the results that you want. I get some shadows that aren't very dramatic, and when I'm using an infinite light, I'm going to set these to ray trace. We're going to get some much sharper shadows. They're very dramatic, and we have this issue where, as this light is cast, I'll zoom in here, we have the dark sides of our objects are not illuminated, so we want to start to think about a fill. So I'm rendering this yellow light, this kind of warm sunshine, and maybe I'll even shift it closer to orange. Maybe orange or even like starting to get into the red a little bit. I'll leave it kind of orange for now. And what I want to do is I want to complement that light by providing a fill light. And I'll just do this temporarily with a point light. Later I'll change this probably to an area light or maybe even another infinite light. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to reposition this point light, and just to experiment with some of the qualities of the light, I'm going to send this towards blue so that it maybe it's bouncing off some of the atmosphere, and we're getting a complement of a blue light. and I'll give that a quick render. So I have this warm sunlight coming in, I have this blue that's bouncing back off of the atmosphere to provide some of the fill, and I'll just take that way down. I don't want to be too dramatic with it. And so I'm not playing with any of the qualities of global illumination yet. I'll probably introduce a sky, not a physical sky yet, maybe just a standard sky, so that I get rid of that vacuum of space, that black background. I'll get rid of that. And now the scene, it starts to feel like it's a little bit more alive. I'm casting shadows. I have some colors in my lights, which are starting to set this off. And then later I'll start to play with some of my render settings. So I'm going to spend some time offline creating variation on my buildings. I'm also going to start to set up my grid of my city. And I'm not going to overbuild this, because ultimately what's going to happen is that, I'm going to build kind of, several square blocks, and I'll introduce some cameras, and I want to think about what's happening on the horizon line. But I don't need to build an enormous, 64 or 128 block city, because I'm going to do some simple camera fly-throughs maybe, and some still renders to see what's going on with my city. But I want to think of this kind of like a Hollywood set. I only want to build information that's going to be visible by the camera. I don't really care what's going on way back off here unless I'm actually going to see it. So I'll spend some time thinking about that a little bit later. But for now, what I want to do is I want to spend some time offline roughing out my these blocks and just kind of move them around. I'll just select the three-way and copy and paste, and I'll move that around by holding down Shift, or maybe I'll just key in the value directly of minus 4,000. Oops, that kind of took off on me. Just back that off to 4,000. There we go, and it snaps back into place. And really figure out how I want my city laid out. I'll also start to think about some simple options like some trees and some stoplights and some other things that'll start to make this city feel like it's populated. Maybe I'll even model some really simple cars based on what I know about the modeling tools inside Cinema 4D. So let's start to light our scene and start to rough out the buildings and the city streets. And we'll catch up in the next presentation and take a deeper dive into setting up this project and getting some other assets integrated into this project. We'll catch up in the next presentation.